Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Butterfly Process Discussion Series, an opportunity for community learning and dialogue. My name is Rebecca Kirk, and I am the Director of Community and Learning for Boston Lyric Opera. We are happy to partner with New Orleans Opera on this discussion series. Before we begin, I will give you a brief overview. Today's session will be 90 minutes. Orientalism and Cultural Appropriation focuses on the learning and engaging with how Orientalism has influenced Western European art, and by extension, how Eurocentric art and Madama Butterfly specifically has defined, perpetuated, and reinforced specific and narrow attitudes of AAPI people and cultures. Phil Chan will guide a conversation with scholars Mari Yoshihara, Josephine Lee, composer Huang Ro, and artist Michael Sakamoto to contextualize these themes and frame a community discussion with fellow artists who are engaged with us on this year-long process. As a community guest, your role today is important. We invite you to watch, listen, and hold space for these important conversations. I'd like to invite you to take a deep breath in and then slowly release it, grounding in this present moment. We each come here today as people holding multiple identities from many different places together in this virtual space. At Boston Lyric Opera, we live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts peoples. We recognize that the colonization of these lands continues to affect the original inhabitants of the land after more than 400 years. Before we invite Phil and our featured speakers on screen to begin, I invite you, if you haven't already done so, to read and acknowledge our community agreements. They were provided in the slides at the beginning of this event, included in your confirmation information, and also are available on our website. We're providing them in the chat now for your reference. These community agreements are created to support all of us here today, hold a safe space, and even though we can't see each other, be together. Thank you for honoring these agreements today. We acknowledge that the content of this discussion series may be sensitive and triggering to some. We encourage you to participate and engage to the extent that you feel most comfortable. BLO has partnered with Aware Lab at the Boston University School of Social Work, and they have generously shared resources for our community who wish to seek additional support, particularly those in our community who identify as AAPI and BIPOC. You can find a link to these resources on our website. A few housekeeping things for today. There's an opportunity to submit questions for our speakers through the Q&A feature. We may or may not have time to answer all the questions submitted, but we will do our best. We've also enabled the closed captioning feature for this webinar. You may choose to hide or show it by clicking on the icon next to the Q&A feature. Additional information about the butterfly process, including the bios of our featured speakers, can be found on blo.org. And if you missed the first discussion in our series, you may watch it anytime for free on operabox.tv. This session will be available to stream next week. Thank you again for being with us here today. And now I invite Phil Chan and our featured speakers to begin today's discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's conversation is about Orientalism and cultural appropriation. And I thought a really interesting way to talk about this work, which has helped me, is to approach it from many different angles. So my work with Final Bow for Yellowface, not only as a creative, but also as a scholar. And so I wanted to invite a few folks who are both experts in their fields and also have some relation to Madama Butterfly and Asian representation to bring together a conversation that really outlines the history of Orientalism, the context within looking at Orientalist work today for a multiracial society, and then what are some creative solutions for moving works of art forward, and just in general, how do we improve Asian representation? So the flow of the conversation today, each of the panelists is going to take a couple minutes to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work, so we have some background, and then we're just going to step back and just have a conversation and just hear what these folks have to talk about. And then we're going to invite the invited artists who are part of the BLO cast to participate and ask questions. And so hopefully we're just going to watch a really interesting, lively conversation. One of the takeaways we're hoping to get out of this conversation is to think more thoughtfully about how we take works from the European canon, and how do we question them, how do we bring them forward for a multiracial audience that we are today. And hopefully we can draw some parallels about how this larger work relates to how we produce other operas and other works of the performing arts in the future as well. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Josephine Lee, who's the English and Asian American Studies at University of Minnesota. Dr. Mari Yoshihara, who's the professor and chair of American Studies at the University of Hawaii, and where it's like in the 70s right now, so lucky you. Michael Sakamoto, who's the choreographer, interdisciplinary artist, and he's also the director of Asian and the Asian American Arts and Culture at UMass Fine Arts Center. And my good friend, new friend, Huang Ro, who's a composer, and we're working together on a new piece actually next month. So thank you so much. Why don't we start with Joe?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be with you all today. I am a professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota, and I write primarily on Asian American theater and performance, but also on the history of Orientalism in American theater.
Great. Mari?
Hi everyone, I speak to you from the island of Oahu, the land of the Kanaka Maoli people. I'm a professor of American Studies at the University of Hawaii, and I write about U.S. cultural history, U.S. East Asian relations, classical music. In particular, my first book was about white women and American Orientalism, and my second book was about Asians and Asian Americans in classical music. And then my most recent book is about Leonard Bernstein in Japan. So I write generally about Asians and classical music and American society and culture more generally.
West Side Story in the East, right? East Side Story. Michael.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Sakamoto. Use he, him, his pronouns, coming to you from traditional Nonotuc land in what we know as Western Massachusetts. I'm an interdisciplinary artist, as Phil said, primarily dance theater, but also media and photography. I am a fourth generation Japanese American, and I am my day job, so to speak, is I'm the director of Asian and Asian American Arts and Culture program, and also the performing arts curator at the UMass Amherst Fine Arts Center. And I also have practice as a scholar and higher ed educator, and I write on trans-cultural, and also specifically right now, trans-Pacific performative identity, inter-Asian performative identity in my book, An Empty Room, Imagining Bhutto and the Social Body in Crisis comes out in April. Thank you.
Great. And last but not least, Huang Ro.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and from the East Coast. And I'm a composer. People always ask what kind of composer you are. So I write music of today. For my work, I focus on opera, symphonic work, installation, and conceptual work. For my cultural background, I am Chinese American, and I want to use my music to transform all the issues we are dealing with today that is really relating to our struggle as an Asian American.
Great, fabulous. So as you can see, we have quite a diverse and interesting group of folks here with lots of different backgrounds. So again, wanted to just outline sort of three areas of focus for us. Sort of what is Orientalism and cultural appropriation, and in the context of Butterfly, what are we looking at? Talking about the dynamic this sort of fantasy Asia creates, especially as it impacts people of Asian descent. And then finally, what are some creative or ways forward solutions for maintaining repertory from Europe, but also creating new spaces for Asian Americans in our community to express themselves on their terms as well. So maybe just kicking us off with sort of a broad definition of Orientalism, and I might have to rely on one of my professors here. Can we get just a general idea of what Orientalism is, just for folks who might be new to this concept?
I can do that, I guess.
Fabulous, Mari.
As a scholar who wrote a book about Orientalism, perhaps I should take the lead. So Orientalism is a concept that was most powerfully theorized by cultural and literary critic Edward Said, right, in his book called Orientalism, originally published in 1978. And to put it very simply, Orientalism is a Western discourse. So to put that even more plainly, Western ways of understanding and representing the so-called Orient, this emphasis on this, that's premised on two most basic assumptions. One is that the essential difference between the East and the West, and also the essential power inequality between the East and the West. So that's Orientalism, and some of the most common expressions of Orientalism include things like exoticization of the Orient. So even when the Orient is treated and understood as something that is attractive and appealing, it's always assumed that it's essentially and fundamentally different, right? And it's the difference that is part of the large part of the appeal. So the exoticization is a very important and fundamental function of Orientalism. Another manifestation is that Orientalism typically objectifies the Orient as the place, culture, people, object, etc. is seen as something that is the essential other object that is to be either consumed or appropriated for the interests of the West. So objectification is a second feature. Another typical expression of Orientalism is feminization. because power relations are often expressed in gendered and sexualized terms, most typically, and this Madama Butterfly is the most typical example, is that the West is seen as this masculine white power, and then the Orient is represented as feminine, in the form of Cho-Cho-san in the case of Madama Butterfly. Orientalism typically treats or sees the Orient as a feminized object. And then another feature of Orientalism is that it homogenizes the quote-unquote Orient. So not only are Japan, China, Korea all treated the same, but whether it's East Asia or Southeast Asia or South Asia or even the Middle East, they're all kind of seen as this undifferentiated mass called the Orient. So that's some of the most common typical features of Orientalism. And because it's a discourse, and I'm not going to get too academic here, but what it means to call Orientalism as a discourse is that Orientalism keeps producing and reproducing these tropes, right? Tropes or vocabularies or narratives about the Orient that then informs each other. So in terms of Madama Butterfly, Madama Butterfly was originally just this one story written by this one guy, but then it was turned into this play, and especially with Puccini's opera, it became such a powerful and influential narrative that then got reworked in so many ways. I just recently read this big book. It's a real doorstopper of a book. It's like 600 pages, called Extreme Exoticism. The title sort of says it all. But it has, really has hundreds of pages of account about different. It's not all about Madama Butterfly, but the fact that this book is 600 pages shows just how powerfully reproductive the Madama Butterfly trope and narrative is, right? So it really functions as a discourse that inform one another, that then also come to form a particular kind of canonization, right? Certain kinds of narratives become authorized and canonized. So as far as especially Orientalism as it pertains to Madama Butterfly, that's my kind of 3-minute. I hope it was 3-minute version of Orientalism. And then Joe can follow up.
So I have to hand it to Mari because she kind of exemplifies like how academics are such nerds, right? I just returned it was more than 600 pages, Anthony Shepard's book on extreme Orient. I just returned my copy to the library, or the library's copy, having looked through it, to find some things that I was looking for, and it's quite a long read. Just to kind of build on some of the things Mari was saying, the way in which we use the term Orientalism now is really influenced by Edward Said and his marvelous book. But his 1978 book really wasn't about Asia per se, right? He was focusing really, I think, on the Arab world, on the Middle East, on the study of Islam. He had a lot to say about that. But I think people who work on particularly East Asia and to some extent other parts of Asia and Asian America more generally have taken this term and run with it, right? And I would say, he certainly didn't invent the term Oriental. I went back, I had to dig out my birth certificate the other day for a driver's license thing, and it says Oriental on it, right? I was born in New Jersey. So this was the official category that we used. It was a state category, a racial category that was definitely in use, right? Supplanting other categories, like I think an earlier state category was Mongolian, right? Used for people of Asian descent, no matter where they came from. I do think, the term Oriental is a racial term. And so people, when they talk about it, nowadays in a North American context, really go to the history of race in America, right? How have people particularly of Asian descent, but to some extent from other places as well, been sort of treated as outsiders, as aliens, as perpetual foreigners. So one of the things that's happened that's kind of interesting if you're looking at just typecasting and racial stereotypes, which I've done a lot of looking at it in theater terms, is how many kinds of varieties there are, but they're all sort of interconnected, right? So the type we're talking about today with Madama Butterfly is the kind of exotic, beautiful, submissive, self-sacrificing Japanese woman, right? Who was reproduced in other kinds of Asian forms, right? There are Chinese versions, there were Indian versions, there are all kinds of versions of this creature. And I think in some ways she was, her conception was a product of sort of three different kinds of interest in the Orient writ large, right? One was imperialism, right? This sort of move of the US and other sort of Euro-American powers into Asia to sort of take parts of it, Asia and the Middle East, to kind of colonize. So another interest was in trade, sort of going back to a very old notion of the Orient, the Silk Road as a place of profit and adventure. And this takes us all the way back to things like 1001 Nights, the Scheherazade stories, Aladdin, all of those things. And then in the 19th century, a kind of interest on the part of America in sort of putting on exhibition and display different people and performances from Asia, right? So you've got this new interest, a kind of commercial interest in watching people perform, whether it's Asian people themselves imported as performers, as acrobats, as lecturers, or it's more commonly people in Yellowface, right? White actors playing the Orient. And that's the tradition out of which Madama Butterfly emerges. So I'm just gonna stop there, and I can talk more about that later if people would like.
Great, thank you, Joe. I always remember the lyric from The King and I. They feel so sentimental about the Oriental. They always try to turn us inside down and upside out. So it's self-referencing its own parody of its Orientalism, the way it's looking at it. So yeah, I guess I'm curious about specifically to Butterfly and other performing arts. When we talk about cultural appropriation, we're talking about, I guess, Western artists who are taking aspects of another culture, but either for their own profit or misrepresenting it somehow, or usually from one more dominant culture that's taking symbols from another less dominant culture. And so that sort of means that as culture shifts and moves, those goalposts are constantly changing. So it's sort of like an influx conversation. And when we're looking at the performing arts, every time we do a show, it's a new ritual. And so kind of how do we navigate these conversations around representation from, I guess, shifting from these fantasy depictions or misinformed depictions or selective depictions to something with a little bit more nuance? I know, Michael, you kind of question this in your work too.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's so many factors, right? I mean, there's probably 10, 20 things to consider, but the first one that jumps into my head when you ask that is both looking out and looking within. So, I'm just going to say it that Asians and Asian Americans, when it comes to racism over the decades and the centuries, we've internalized a lot. And, sometimes some of this you're very aware of, and some of it, is a little more insidious. And so I'll just say, just speaking for myself growing up, so I'm middle-aged, I'm in my, early 50s. And so I grew up at a time I guess in a transitional period where in American and Asian American society, for example, the term Oriental was still very much in common use, when I was a kid in the 70s, and then even as a teen and young adult in the 80s. And so we didn't, as a little kid, we didn't, even in LA, we didn't actually think much of it. It was just a thing. And so how you then take a journey, so talking about from within, how I then, for example, took a journey from growing up Japanese American and Asian American in LA in a very, in a heavily Asian community, to then wanting to branch out just, as an adult, as a young artist, et cetera. And then eventually working my way back to it after accepting, that and having my eyes open to the greater, more insidious aspects of white supremacy, how it operated, not just in America, but internationally when I'd lived abroad a couple times. And, that gave me a lot, still gives me a lot as an artist, as a creator, and as a scholar, to unpack, either through personal narrative that inspires creative expression, and also as a scholar, as an autoethnographer who creatively unpacks myself in a critical, intellectual way. We have to sort of walk very publicly, like walk our talk in a very public way. This brings up the issues, for example, of different standards depending on what art form. So opera being being a high art Western opera, being a high art, Euro-American high art, there are different standards of race and exotification and appropriation and issues of Yellowface or being colorblind, casting, all those sort of things. I come primarily from the dance field, where we have it's sort of a flip thing where it's like you at this point you want to be very acknowledged, the body and the identity that you're sitting in. Whereas I think in much more sort of arts that are weighed down by Euro-American conservatism, like opera or theater, classical music, these things, it's not that they're further back, but they're dealing with it in a different way just because there's more baggage involved. I still hear more conversation, for example, in those areas about how artists don't want to be seen as Asian or and such, whereas in the dance world, we already went through that 20 years ago. So now it's like, what do you have to acknowledge it, and you're not acknowledging it's to the degree you're acknowledging it or not. And then as Asian and Asian American artists, we still have to look at ourselves and say, all right, how much am I caring about being seen in my Asianness or not? How much Asianness do I actually own? How much do I actually claim? And that's like a different thing for me as a fourth generation Japanese American than for someone who's second generation in the 21st century, right? So it's complicated.
This is really building on a concept for them from the last Butterfly session, where we were looking at the history of Butterfly itself and how even just the work had changed over time. And so as we as a society are changing, our work also is changing. And that's part of the challenge and pleasure and creative questions that come out of this process. Since we do have the composer of M Butterfly here on the line, I think that's a really interesting case study as it pertains to Madama Butterfly. And I guess one of my questions is, how did you unpack some of the issues with the original opera and twist it in a way that still gives the original flavor or a nod to the original, but also something for people living today, people alive today?
Thank you, Phil. I think when we talk about the original Madama Butterfly, of course, we should treat it as a historical document. It was in Puccini's Europe, not writing a story about Italian, but about Asian and American. and a lot of people focus on the, the problematic issues with Cho-Cho-Sang. Of course, there is the, Asian female being portrayed as submissive, as sacrificing for, for whatever the opera considered for her son or for love, for her shame. But also, I want to just have us to think a little deeper of all the male characters, the Asian male characters in the opera, and including the Brahms and the Gora and also the Prince. I remember when David Henry Hwang wrote in the preface of his famous play Madama Butterfly, he said Asian women were considered submissive and very feminine, and Asian men are considered half men. We are not masculine enough. We are not strong enough. We're supposed to be quiet and also, and then later on become the whole model minority issue coming in for all Asians. But if we look at all these three characters in Madama Butterfly, the uncle who becomes such an angry, almost like a evil dragon, shouting at everybody, being portrayed as a devil. And the marriage matchmaker Gora also is a devil character. And the prince who already married but want to marry more women. So to me, it's more than just one or two characters being stereotyped and being culturally appropriated. But the whole mentality, I still feel that is not just a relic of the 19th century, but in fact that carry on even to the very day of today. I was talking with my friend Ed Yum the other day. I was saying for Asian male, for example, if you are open, active, loud, and and you are being perceived as very aggressive, very out of space, very out of place. So I think that kind of mentality, which of course brought to the issue of Madama Butterfly, which was created as a play by David Henry Hwang and based on a true story. And in the case of Madama Butterfly, which we turn the table around, is not Pinkerton, who became the how should I say? Instead of Cho-Cho-Sang being the one sacrificed and die, but at the end was Gallimard, who was portrayed as the Pinkerton, the French diplomat, and who did not want to face the reality, but he considered himself being the Cho-Cho-Sang and died at the end, committed suicide. So with an opera coming, which will be premiered this summer in Santa Fe Opera, I just feel that being a play, it has extraordinary power to create the story, to counter the issues of Madama Butterfly. But it belonged to an opera stage as well, because it was inspired by an opera. So how do we turn the table around? For example, the issue of the white man with Gallimard or with Pinkerton, for that sake, has this perception of what Oriental woman should be. And in Madama Butterfly, David asked this question: Did Gallimard really not know who he fell in love with is a man or a woman? What make him not aware of it? And of course, in the true story, the French diplomat also, he was fooled at the very, very beginning. So, and the conclusion David had was because he had the perception of what Eastern female should be. And he fell in love with that image, with that perception. instead of fell in love with a true human being, equal human being in front of him. So yeah, there's much to talk about in M Butterfly, but the main idea is we want to create an update with the story being turned around and really address the issue of East and West imbalance and also stereotype existing in both from the Western culture towards the East.
So I'm going to just jump in with Phil's smile, signaling me that's okay. First of all, to say, to show a picture, I don't know if we can see it. When I got this from the Santa Fe Opera, I was so excited, right, to see Huang's collaboration with David Henry Wong, whose play M Butterfly really made me newly interested in the whole Madame Butterfly story, right? And I do feel like one of the things that's marvelous is it doesn't necessarily take away from the larger question of why do we keep redoing Madame Butterfly, right? What's the appeal of this story? So that's one question. But the idea that Asian and Asian American artists are able to tell their version, right? To have that perspective. And that's something that was for a long time not true, right? That the problem with the stereotypes and Orientalism wasn't just that they were kind of distortions based on fantasy. It was also who got to sort of dominate the narrative. And if you juxtapose the kind of hyper visibility of stereotypes with the invisibility, the relative invisibility of actual Asian Americans, right? That's where the problem gets even worse, right? That the only way in which people could be legible in some ways, particularly in the arts, was by adopting the very stereotypes that sort of distorted people's perceptions of them, right? It's kind of like African Americans having to take on blackface roles when they first got into vaudeville and musical theater, that in some ways the only available roles for Asian and Asian American performers have been these sort of exotic types. So I'm super excited, Huang, both by your work with the opera. Also, I wanted to just give a nod, speaking of characters, the character that for me was made so interesting when I read Mari Yoshihara's book, Embracing the East, which I will recommend to everyone. I mean, it is really the definitive work on this topic, was the character of Pinkerton's wife, right? The fact that in this opera, it includes a range of different types. And I would say she is a type too. You know, she's a type because she's so easily sort of disregards Koko-san as a true rival, and she sort of embraces her as a plaything, right? And this is literally sort of out of that story, that she does not really take this woman seriously at all. But she sort of is also sort of swept away by how beautiful she is, right? So she has her own sort of, I don't know, embrace of the East. And I was so fascinated by the way Mari portrayed that, right? That it's not just, in other words, a male sort of desiring the female. It's this sort of vision of America, right, male and female, desiring the East, right, and buying things from the East and wanting to see operas like Madame Butterfly.
Well, thank you, Joe, for the publicity for my book. I should hire you as my publicist. And I want to follow up a little on what Joe said about Asian artists, the importance of having Asian artists on the creative, production side of things, because in the case of the specific field of so-called classical music in general, right? As many people probably know, there are actually lots of Asians and Asian Americans in the classical music field. Oftentimes they are perceived to be quote unquote overrepresented, because if you look at, for instance, various conservatories, especially in the strings and piano, there are many programs where the majority or even the entirety of the student body are Asian, especially East Asian descent. And if you look at, for instance, the orchestra roster of the New York Philharmonic, about a third of the orchestra musicians are Asian. So compared to the overall population US demographics, where Asians comprise about 6-7% of the entire population, in many, I wouldn't say many, in some areas of classical music, there are actually overrepresentations of Asians. But it, of course, manifests differently. I mean, what that means, and also Orientalism, or more broadly, kind of racialized ideas about Asians, how that impacts musicians of Asian descent differs across genres, right? So it works differently for instance, violinists, where in many, especially orchestra musicians, they're often seen as all interchangeable and the same. They're often seen as sort of technically, perfect, but lacking in individual artistry. Some of you are probably familiar with the so-called Zuckerman incident that happened in June of last June, I guess. This very insensitive and quite frankly racist remarks that this very prominent and influential violinist made vis-a-vis these young Asian students. So that's common among, say, for instance, string players, because they are considered to be overrepresented. I'm sure, Juan Ro can talk about this, but it manifests differently for composers who create their own music. So they're differently situated than, say, instrumentalists who primarily perform the music that is predominated by, white men composers. They're performers of other people's music. Whereas for some composers, I have heard from the composers that I interviewed that they're often expected to produce certain kinds of sound that the people who are listening consider to be Asian, right? And they are presumed to embody and express certain kinds of Asianness that may or may not be in sync with their own ideas about music or Asianness, whatever. And then also for opera, people who are in opera, that they have the burden of different kind of Orientalism or racism, because there is this whole issue of casting, which I know is going to be discussed more in detail later on. So Orientalism, the impact of Orientalism or racialized ideas about Asians impact Asian musicians differently, and also Orientalism it's a very powerful and lasting discourse, but it also manifests differently depending on different historical and political contexts, right? So Orientalism during the period of the original Madama Butterfly, when the discourse of yellow peril combined, that came out of both the Japan's victory in Russo-Japanese War and also increased Asian immigration in the United States. That kind of Orientalism is different from like Orientalism during the 1930s, for instance, when China was U.S. ally, and then after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, like Japan became this mortal enemy. They were like, at that time, Japanese and Chinese were actually understood differently by Americans. And then during the Cold War era, when the racial integration and decolonization was at least the premise sort of ideology, official ideology, then Orientalism got manifested differently. Like the film Sayonara, for instance, it's a reworking of Madama Butterfly narrative, but also different in important ways, right? And then of course Orientalism during the trade war with Japan, that culminated in incidents like the murder of Vincent Chin. That's a different kind of Orientalism than the Orientalism of Sayonara. And then also the kind of Orientalism and racialized and racist discourse about Asians today in the middle of the COVID pandemic. That's also different. So there are still all Orientalists and racist, but it gets expressed differently in different contexts. So I think that's important to understand. I'll pause there for now.
Can I just jump in for a few points, Mari? Thank you for making, and you have such a very insightful article in Symphony America's magazines recently. I will encourage everybody to read. As a composer who are in the symphonic and opera world, I just want to echo you of saying, the idea of you are expected to write in certain way, or you are expected to being placed in certain category and programming space as an Asian American artist. I think that is has not been changed much, unfortunately. I started as a symphonic composer. I also wrote Symphony No. 1, and of course, you never really get programmed if you are an Asian composer writing Symphony No. 1. Then what music got programmed a lot from my category is music with titles is more, has Eastern wordings or meanings behind them.
California Roll, Blowing in the Wind of the Moonlight Bamboo Grove.
Right, not written
Symphony
by
No. 1.
Asian composer, except. So then you start realizing all those pieces are being programmed on, the Lunar New Year concert, or AAPI month celebration concert, or educational outreach concerts to Asian communities. Struggling with that for many years, I just felt that I should try something different. So I ventured into opera writing because of the belief that there's no opera house will have a whole season dedicating to Asian operas. So I will have a chance to be programmed next to Verdi or Puccini or even Wagner. So what is really interesting is by my own choice, after I started writing opera, I realized in some cases, Asian stories and Asian American stories, even up to today, were not told by Asian or Asian American creators. Sometimes you found, the creative team are Caucasians. They are writing folk or traditional stories from Asia, or writing about Asian American struggles. And then I told myself, why I'm sitting here waiting for? I should be the voice to write for that. If I'm not doing that, who else? I need to jump into that, not because I suddenly got a lot of calls to do that, but because I feel in this case, I should culturally identified and to create work that matters to my heart and to the people who are struggling with these issues. And that is Asian American. So in this case, I started with Bound, which is was my second opera, and Nina Nelson, who will be on the panel as well, and who premiered the opera with me in Houston. Nina Yoshida Nelson, mezzo soprano. And later on, I wrote An American Soldier, and now I wrote Butterfly. And I don't mind to be pigeonholed in this case, just because the cause and the task is too great to let go and just declare myself to be an international composer, borderless, cultureless. I just want to write my Symphony No. 1. I just want to write about George Washington. No, I have more important things to write about. But yes, the idea of cultural appropriation and Yellowface and all of that is still alive and is still happening. So I'm glad Boston Lyric Opera really giving us this chance to really to have our voice to be heard. And I do hope that more and more places to really let us to address these issues we are facing.
So I'm going to jump in as well. And I'm agreeing with, of course, with everything everyone's saying. I just as speaking as both an artist, but also as a presenter, you know, and I think, I suppose this is really directed very specifically at our audience and at our field, you know, because I think there's some important things to remember. So when you look at works like Madama Butterfly, you know, someone just spoke about, you know, why, I think it was Huang, about white folks telling those, you know, our stories. So just, you know, and this is true about any community. If someone else is telling your story, it's actually not your story. Just straight up, by definition, right? It's just a metaphysical truth. So for us to take this material, or you have to kind of understand that it's somewhere along the lines of maybe a spectrum of like reaction versus or response, or is it, you know, like Huang was just advocating for, very rightly so, a moment ago, an original narrative, you know, where you're actually operating fundamentally from your own cultural context, your own identity, your own vernacular, right? And so that's what's most important for you to be able to tell your own story, is to tell it in the most embodied way somehow. And so as a presenter, you know, I always feel that it's my obligation to really look at the works that you know, we're considering, we're curating, and understand, you know, first and foremost, what is that lens? What is that position? What is that, you know, where's your subject position of the artist? And where is the subject position of the audience? You know, what does the audience want and why do they want it? And it's not that you can't present work that, you know, I don't want to say panders, but let's say, you know, just simply sits within the mainstream or sits within a kind of dominant ideology. It's really about how you present it, how you frame it, right? So if I'm presenting, you know, something that is very, you know, sort of very deep within the canon of Euro-American, the performing arts, you know, whether it's opera or music or theater or anything, or dance, how is, you know, what kind of dialogue, how does our presentation of the work prompt our audience and our community to think about these larger issues, just like BLO is doing right now, very, you know, and which I'm grateful for. You know, at the same time, I think the field and artists and arts professionals and the audiences also have to remember the realities of presenting. So, you know, we're under just as many constraints and pressures and limitations, and, you know, complexities as anybody else. So the program that I direct at UMass, the Asian and Asian American Arts and Culture program, you know, I'm, on the one hand, I'm incredibly grateful that the program's been around for almost 3 decades. On the other hand, it's always been underfunded, you know, and that's not a complaint. That's just a reality. That's how it is in America. You know, it's constantly underfunded, and yet it's one of the only programs of its type to exist in the university presenting space, like, ever. And so, you know, thinking about, you know, what's at stake, I think is really what I want to kind of promote, you know, put out there as a takeaway for our audience today is, you know, what's at stake? What's at stake for, you know, with all due respect for Boston Lyric Opera by doing this wonderful process series? What's at stake for the artists who are giving themselves to this process? And by artists, I mean primarily the Asian or Asian American identified artists. Because, you know, in the end, I'll just say, speaking for myself, Asians and Asian Americans actually don't need opera, don't need Western opera. Western opera needs us if it wants to actually make fundamental change. So.
Mic drop there. I think this is a great time to invite some of the artists from Butterfly to come on in, join the call. Come on in, folks. Hi, Nina, nice to see you. So just wanted to first open up the floor to anybody, and maybe as you're introducing yourself, say your name and the role you were supposed to sing in this original Butterfly production, and just feel free to ask any questions of the panelists. Go ahead, Nina, I see you.
So
Thanks for having me. I'm curious, to those of you who are on the panel, you know, we talk about how important it is to have Asian American creatives telling these stories. But I'm curious as to how you would solve the problem of then getting pigeonholed into only telling these stories, because that's kind of what I found a lot in my career. How do we get over that?
Nina, is that a question for me?
Could be for anybody, sure.
Okay. Since I turned on my mic, as what I say, you know, sometimes it's bad to be pigeonholed, and sometimes, in this case, I think, at least for me, I need to go through this process, which means if I'm not being pigeonholed to create this work, of course, I do not want to be pigeonholed. But I do want that whenever there's a chance, I could create operas on the Asian American issues and struggles. I want to be called, I want to be given the opportunity to create. If an opera house come to me and say, hey, we could have you to choose what subject you want. Do you want to tell a story about I'm just making it up, about George W. Bush, or a story about a regular unknown Asian American struggle? I would say I want to write about Asian American stories. So only when there's enough repertoires out there, and by doing so, we could also lift all the Asian American artists, by giving everyone also the right good chance to being seen and heard. And then eventually we will progress to that stage that everyone could be, treated. I could write anything I want. Since I don't feel really obligated, I must do this first. Yeah. Of course, I also had a conversation with a conductor once, was saying, I don't want to conduct Asian works. No, this conductor is Asian conductor or Asian American conductor. And this conductor want to do mainstream Western, the dead composers repertoire to prove this conductor can fit in, can take on Mahler, can take on Beethoven. I said, great, you should do that. But also don't forget, you are in the position, you have the obligation to help other Asian and Asian American artists. You absolutely can do that, but you chose not to. So it's a choice. It is a step by step. But eventually, I think, there is a responsibility. Just as a creator, I feel heavily on my shoulder. I should focus on my limited time to do certain things first. And then I can go forward from there.
I'd like to jump in just very quick also to answer Nina. So, pigeonholing is racism. And so you can't force people to be not racist. But what you can do, at least in my experience, one approach I keep going back to is just simply laying out the facts. And so how you sort of conduct yourself, parallel to, I think, what Wang was just describing, in the way that sort of, how like living and breathing and expressing, displaying a reality that people can't unsee, can't unhear. I presented Jennifer Koh, the violinist, last fall, and Jennifer's just so good at doing that in a very, not like didactic and not hammering on people's head, but just very simple way. When someone said, well, what about for those, artists, even some Asians and audiences who like the canon, who like things the way they are? And she said, well, for me, it comes down very simply. Do you want to read the same history book that was written in 1880 for the rest of your life or not? And, so, I mean, that was just one example, one way to put it, but it's like you have to kind of like really firmly hold the space of reality and the world you want to live in.
if I could also jump in and follow up, I think Nina's question is a really difficult one and a very real one. And of course, it's much easier for someone like me who basically critiques and theorizes from the outside. I'm not in the arts world and I do this history and criticism and all that. But for people who are, actual artists in the field who have to, you are a singer and you want to be cast, right? You want to sing on stage. And if the butterfly, when I was doing research for musicians from a different shore, I encountered a number of people, singers, who said that even though their voice is actually not suited for the butterfly role, when they go to audition for other roles, then they are asked to, can you sing Chocho-san? That's just, because there's this assumption that just by being Asian, you authentically embody Chocho-san or any other Asian role, of which there are very few, right? So do you use that as an opportunity because you want to be on stage, you take that opportunity, or do you say, no, this is racist and, all that? And I'm certainly not the one to take sort of this, moral high ground and say, no, you should reject, such roles because it's racist. It's not my artistic career, so I can't say those things. But I think there are important lessons to be learned from history in that. Kunio actually talked about this a little bit in the last session, but starting with somebody like Miura Tamaki, who was one of the first Asian musicians to have an international career by singing the role of Chocho-san. Really, her career, international career, would not have existed without the opera and without the role, right? And somebody like her, but also a number of other Asian and other artists historically, some of which are covered in Shepard's book. Once they were cast in that role, they have agency, right? It may be very limited agency, because I understand that, production of an opera is a very big thing, and in many ways very hierarchical relationships among different parties. So it's not like individual artists have a lot of say, but whatever say you have as an artist, you should say them. You should exercise agency. So, for instance, Tamaki Miura made a lot of input in the production process, like trying to, make it as authentic, or at least as unauthentic as they could make it. And in a number of other, either Hollywood or stage productions, there are many ways in which Asians, made input in the production process, either vis-a-vis the conductors or composers or the producers, etc. So I think that is not to be taken lightly, that role you have as an artist. And then I also wanted to mention Pulitzer Prize winning novelist and critic Viet Thanh Nguyen has this excellent piece about this concept of narrative plenitude. He wrote this piece in response to the film Crazy Rich Asians, and he talks about how, because he's a scholar of the representations of Vietnam War, among other things, he mentions how, how many Hollywood films about the American War in Vietnam there are, and they're not all the same, but there are just so many, right? Whereas in terms of Asian and Asian American representations in major Hollywood film, there's been Joy Luck Club and there's been Crazy Rich Asians. Of course, there are tons of excellent films by Asian and Asian American filmmakers, but because there are just so few that get circulated among the mainstream market. That's exactly what's happening with Madama Butterfly. The problem with Madama Butterfly is not just about the inherent problem of the Madama Butterfly as an opera, but the fact that is it in terms of, aside, well, maybe there's Turandot, but that has related and all, similar kinds of issues. If there were a dozen operas that get presented regularly, that feature Asian stories written by Asian, artist, composers, librettists, etc., produced by, I'm not saying that everybody in the production team have to be Asian, but if there are different kinds of narratives about Asian people that gets regularly seen by the audience, that's a different story. Then Madama Butterfly will be put in its place. I think think the canon needs to be put in its place. I don't think it needs to be canceled altogether. I think, Madama Butterfly can continue to be produced as long as it is put in its place and it's contextualized and, it's critically appreciated by both the artist and the audience alike.
So I wanted just to inject two notes. One is that Madame Chocho-san is a breakthrough role, not just for Asians and Asian American singers, but Camilla Williams, right, the first Black woman to sing sort of professionally with the New York City Opera, 1946. That was the role she made her debut in, right? So these Oriental roles have also provided avenues for other artists of color to sort of make themselves known, right? It's kind of an interesting other history. But just on the role, I had first of all, I wanted to express my appreciation for being able to actually dialogue with artists. When I've been on other panels, oftentimes it's just sort of audience response to usually somebody makes a complaint about a particular production and then there's a community meeting. But this provides a much, I think, more wonderful conversation that can happen with artists, right, about their own kind of agency, creative ability within roles. And I will say something that I said recently. I was on a panel on Asian representation in opera for Minnesota Opera, but I'll make the same statement. You don't have to do Butterfly in the same way, right? That's also a myth. Puccini the libretto from the Puccini opera is based on David Belasco's work, which was based on John Luther Long, who based his short story on several different novelistic versions similar previously, many of which, including Long's, had a different ending, right? So in Long's short story, this probably came out in December, she did not kill herself, right? She thought about it. She went and picked up the knife and started cutting, and then she's interrupted by her maid Suzuki, and then when they come back the next day, she's gone with the child, right? So you don't have to do that. I mean, I keep wondering why there isn't, like, theatrically speaking, there's so many creative ways to reference this, even while preserving what everyone seems to love most about this opera is not the story, but the music, right? So you could have just as great a musical impact without necessarily making this a sort of realistic depiction of a Japanese teenager who kills herself for the love of a white man. I mean, you just don't have to do it that way. So I'll end my little rant there.
Thank you so much, Joe. And for the audience, feel free to type any questions you have for any of the panelists in the Q&A, and I can sort of moderate and get them through. I know, Nina, you had something to share as well.
Sure. So as we're talking about, what it's like to be Asian American versus Asian from Asia and telling these stories. So like Michael, I'm also fourth generation Japanese American. And so the culture I grew up with was very far away from Japanese from Japan. And all of a sudden I was being pigeonholed into the role of Suzuki. And I had to look around and realize I know nothing about what it's like to be Japanese. I better learn something really quickly. But all of a sudden, here I was, because of the way I look, being typecast into these roles on stage. And, for me, it wasn't until I premiered the opera An American Dream, which talks about Japanese incarceration, in which the librettist interviewed my grandmother, who was interned, and wrote an aria for me with her words about being interned. And then like working on Huang Ruo's operas, which talk a lot about, racism in America against Asian Americans, Asians. And it's that when I feel like, okay, now I am telling a story that I can relate to. And that's been an interesting thing for me.
We had a great question in the Q&A. The idea of pigeonholing isn't just an issue, obviously, for Asian singers. So someone was asking about how do you know when We talked about the issue of being asked to sing Butterfly, even though that isn't your voice type. So, sort of when do you know, when is it like a voice type thing or it's a race thing? Like, where do you draw that line, and how do you know when it's the question was racial profiling or vocal profiling? It just seems like a thorny issue. So are any of the artists, have you had an experience where maybe you were sort of on that line and kind of questioning what that was like?
If anybody has a real story about themselves, go ahead. I have a story about somebody I know. I have some hearsay to add to this, but it's directly applicable.
Yeah, go ahead, Omar.
I just want to say real quick, this isn't a story per se, but in terms of the issue of pigeonholing from voice type versus race and ethnicity, and I'm a second generation Pakistani American. I feel like just because of the way I look and my build and the way those are connected to race, I feel like people always expect a different sound from me than the sound I have. So I'm constantly having to fight against the expectations of the kinds of roles that people want to see me in and the way they imagine my voice based on how I look versus how I actually sound and the kind of repertoire that I'm actually comfortable singing. So that's a kind of ongoing struggle.
Great.
Can I just echo really quickly what Omar is saying? So, I think to also, since Madama Butterfly is an East Asian story, just to point out that, East Asian tropes are kind of have always been the dominant, even I would say up until recently, although not as much in the West. And it both, makes those identified as East Asians and East Asian Americans, both the subject and the sort of victim, so to speak, of all of the negativity, as well as it also gets more of you get more of that reconstructive, regenerative energy and focus, often, or to a certain extent, at the cost of other people in the broader Asian and Asian diaspora. So just to kind of, give a shout out to that larger community, because I think it's important, especially in 2022.
I think it also brings to the point this larger issue that we're talking about, where the Orient is this sort of shifting target, and it's so big that we almost can't hold it, because it could be East Asian or South Asian or Middle East. I mean, and depending on what the geopolitics are at the time, after 9/11, it was Muslims, it was people from the Middle East, and now in COVID, it's East Asian. So it does tend to shift things around. So again, just really thinking about in the context of these works like Butterfly that have a specific fantasy, and I think, and Joe or maybe Mari, somebody was talking about how the fantasy is this sort of fixed idea that, like, even as society continues, this sort of fantasy remains stuck because it is a fantasy. So as artists, how do we keep reinventing that or keeping it fresh in order not to get in that kind of stuck place? And maybe I'll just call on Huang Ro for this one, because he's an expert at using this kind of stuck place actually to generate new material and new creativity. So what does that look like in practice?
Sorry, Phil, my camera froze a little bit. Could you repeat the question?
Just asking you about how you use like Orientalism, something that is pigeonholing or boxes you in, and how do you use that to generate something new and creative? That's what does that process actually look like?
I think that, my personal experience, as well I explained, there was very different feeling when I was a symphonic composer versus an operatic composer. With opera, we tell stories with words. So I do feel that in this case, as an Asian American, I know what I want to write about. So no matter, you call that pigeonhole or not, I just feel, this is the story I want to tell. Now, I do want to say that the concept of pigeonhole is a top-down concept also, instead of just bottom-up, which means I think we often talk about the gatekeepers. Now, in this case, you have gatekeepers in the symphonic world. Those are the conductors, the artistic administrators. In the opera world, those are the general directors, the artistic directors or cast directors. Now, in the ideal world, if you ask me, what would be the ideal situation? I would say all the AAPI artists and minority artists, we should be casted or being provided the opportunity to sing in all variety kind of operas, aside just from Madama Butterfly or operas has Asian subjects. My second point to make is, but when opera comes to this subject, I personally would prefer also want to ask to be cast properly. So you see, I want to see this issue has two folds. Eventually, we want to get there. Everyone is, should be provided the opportunity to sing, to perform. For me, to able to write freely, to write objects or subjects other than Asian stories. I also want to do that, and I can do that. And I welcome people to ask me to write that also. But when there's subject related to Asian stories or Asian American stories, I want to be the one to write it, and also my colleagues who also share the same heritage and same feelings. We should be asked to write for that also. So yeah, I hope this explained a little bit.
Yeah, we had a couple questions from the audience about other works that represent Asians, and either the artists or the panelists. This is for anybody, but questions about Nixon in China, and what is our relationship to that work that is still more recent, and as we are still questioning our relationship with China and its still evolving relationship with a large geopolitical power like China. Does anybody have any thoughts about Orientalism as it relates to an opera more recent, like Nixon in China?
I don't have a specific comment about Nixon in China, but I guess it's a more general comment about the function that we want a work like an opera to serve, right? I mean, that in some ways Nixon in China is based on a particular historical moment that I think it was written in probably the late 80s, right? And it's a moment that many people who attended probably remember, right? Because it didn't happen that much earlier than was going on, right? So in that sense, I mean, it is maybe a little bit like Madama Butterfly in that at the time that Belasco and Puccini were writing, there was this real fascination with Japan, right, as this imperial encounter in Japan, right? That it wasn't recent history. It was 1853, right? And then there's all these stages by which Japan modernized, but it was this definitely a reflection of a fantasy of Japan that was conditioned by a kind of real historic moment. So in some ways, I think the difference is that at the root of Madame Butterfly is this kind of interracial love story, right? So it becomes not about a history moment, a history lesson, or a look at a diplomatic exchange, but a sort of the war, the imperialism becomes a backdrop for what are thought to be these universal emotions of desire and sex and romance and love, right? So that it can be easily reset, like become Miss Saigon, right? In another, you just take another war and another soldier and another couple and another virginal heroine. So Nixon in China would be hard to kind of do that with, right? Because it's so closely tied to that particular moment. So this is not maybe so much about Nixon in China as a contrast as what we want the operas to do for us, right? Whether it's take us to something that is felt to be a universalized emotion, and I'm really suspicious of that word, or whether it's to kind of mark out a moment, a particular moment in history.
That's fabulous, Joe. Thank you. Go ahead.
I have the similar feeling. Operas, for example, Nixon in China, I think all these kind of operas dealing with another culture, we should be more sensitive than just putting out a new production, just random casting, not doing anything to address the issues. And this is why we are doing this today, hosted and provided by Boston Lyric Opera. It's on the right track. You know, when we should not cancel all these operas, because as what Mario was saying, there are great music in them. And opera at the end also a lot is about the music. Don't forget. And I personally would hope people walk away, remember the tune, and then they remember the character instead of remember the character, then remember the tune. So with Madama Butterfly or Nixon in China, or the death of that's another Adams opera. You know, we need to just provide a content for the audience. Instead of, oh, now there's a tension between East and West, then let's program Nixon in China. I think that would be the most naive move to put an opera out just for that reason. And I do think that we need to guide and help our audience to really see through why the opera was created, for what purpose, and what is our modern lens to look at that opera. The history, the past is a mirror that could reflect the present and the future. And if we take away the past, we canceled it, we wash it away, then we don't have that guidance of mirror anymore. And I do feel sometimes that reflection is very, very important, particularly in the opera world.
I think that's lovely. We have one more question, and this is about sort of how do we, if we're creating new art as Asian Americans, it's sometimes new music can be challenging. This person is saying more challenging than, you know, canon works from the canon. So idiom, range, tonality might be more challenging. So how do we work in this field where new music can be inaccessible, but that's the only outlet for an updated racial picture? Like, how do we compete as Asian Americans essentially with the fantasy of Turandot or the fantasy of Butterfly? I mean, Butterfly, the music is just gorgeous. Like, how do we compete with that with the current standards? Omar, you have something to say on that?
Yeah, well, as a singer and composer, I immediately bristle a little bit at the notion that current music can't possibly be as beautiful as Puccini. So I would just say I challenge the assumption that just because a work is a new work, just because a work is by an Asian composer or featuring Asian artists, that the assumption should be that it is, somehow an avant-garde, inaccessible piece. I also separately, in defense of avant-garde pieces, also will say that I think in the particular wording of the question, it said the kind of musical preparation required for a piece like that versus what is taught in conservatory. And I don't know what this could differ from conservatory to conservatory, but I certainly feel like my training prepared, and all of our training as 21st century artists should be preparing us to sing 21st century music.
You know, I'll just add to that too. I think those are great points that Omar is bringing up, and also that this, you know, it's all, I think it's always artists' obligation to speak to the historical moment that we're living in, that they're creating in. And so, you know, at a certain point, you also have to just look at the work in terms of its relationality to all of that. You know, how is an artist actually crafting their expression, crafting their form, crafting their narrative, if a narrative is involved, crafting their voice, no pun intended, so that the work actually speaks to the questions that are already existing, that are already in the zeitgeist. Because audiences, I actually don't, speaking as both artist and presenter, so someone who creates works to go on stage, but also who feels responsibility to create the space of possibility for that. I think we often sell audiences short, perhaps also to Omar's point, which is, the forms of expression that we have now exist for a reason, and it's because they're needed now somehow. And I think that's some people don't usually acknowledge that, and I think we get very hung up by the conservative establishments in any given field to kind of reify all the old tropes, all the old forms, and that's why they stay popular. But I will say also, this youngest generation is not, at the least of any generation in our lifetimes and before our lifetimes, has the least interest possible in sitting in a dark theater and being spoken to and being told what's valuable. They want to be part of the process, or they want to at least have the process speak to them personally. And that's a paradigm shift, and we need to acknowledge that as a field.
I have one last question, and maybe this is a question for folks at home too, who have been listening for the last little bit. Are we done with Orientalism? Like, as a field, as a creative field, is that just like, are we just going to decide that that's not a creative direction that's interesting or yields good art or is particularly creative anymore? Like, or does that mean we're done with Orientalism? What do you guys think? And folks at home, I think this is an ongoing question we're sort of asking ourselves. Omar, yes, go ahead.
My immediate answer is no, and I don't offer that as with any kind of moral judgment on it one way or the other, but just from one particular context, and that's particularly from the abstract musical context. So I'm 34 years old. I grew up watching like Aladdin, and I mean that's even supposed to be the Middle East, but as a child, the score of that, which is totally a westernized version of what Middle Eastern music sounded like, that still had like built a place in my mind as like that's the musical sound of my cultural heritage, even though it's not really, except in the most kind of surface ways. And so I will say, still as a composer, I go to well, I mean, right now I'm working on writing an opera that's set during the partition of India, and I will say it is hard to get away from the idea from the idea of Eastern music, in this case South Asian music, as viewed through the kind of filtering lens of Western music and the westernized view of what that sound world is. So I think it's certainly a continuing process to develop what that is. And that sound world that is tied to Orientalism, I mean, that now has built itself up as a part of my own culture and the cultural world that I was growing up in, and that plays into how I hear and interpret music representing different eras and areas.
So I guess that means I'm having P.F. Chang's for dinner, right? So, I mean, I think this is particularly interesting, especially as we're talking about culture. I mean, it's not just an Asian thing, right? Like West Side Story, here's this other version of people telling a story that's outside of their cultural context, trying to do it with nuance, trying to do it and having some really good art, really beautiful art in it, but it's complicated and it's messy and it's something that somehow keeps regenerating every generation. I guess it keeps coming back. So I think it's beyond just Asian representation. It's how we represent other people that I think is at the heart of this question. And so I just wanted to thank everybody this evening for being a part of this conversation. It's hopefully that you guys will tune in for some of our future conversations coming up. Our next one is the impact of artists and audiences in partnership with the Boston Public Library on February 8th. We're dropping the link in the chat right now, and it will also be on blo.org. So if you want to register for that. If you'd like to watch this conversation again, or you missed our first discussion with Dr. Kunio-Hara in the series, the recordings are available on operabox.tv. And if you have any questions for us, please engage us. We'd love your feedback on how to improve this series. You can send your thoughts to access@blo.org. Once again, thank you so much to all of the artists, to all the speakers, the panelists, to the audience for joining us tonight. And it's just really nice to have these conversations. And thank you, of course, to BLO as an organization for giving us the space to talk about this. I think it's, as Mari said, as Asian Americans, we make up 6 to 7% of the American population, yet we are such a big part of the fantasy imagery that are on the performing arts stages. And so it's so important to dedicate some time and energy to having these conversations and reflecting. And it's my hope that we can take these nuggets that we're unpacking here and apply them to other works in our canon, not just Butterfly and not just around Asians, but thinking about how we can do this in order to shift our larger way of presenting opera from just a Eurocentric singular way of looking at the world to something more multiracial that reflects our communities better. So thank you again to the audience. Thank you so much, BLO. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.